The Heist of the Crystal Bell. The air in the shadowed tavern was thick with smoke and the faint tang of spilt whiskey. It was the sort of place where secrets found their voice, carried on the murmurs of strangers and the clink of half-empty glasses. At a table near the crackling hearth, Silas Drake leaned forward, his voice low, his words deliberate. "They say it's not a bell at all," he began, his dark eyes flickering like coals. "Not in the way we think of it. They say it's alive, watching, waiting." Across from him, Juno scoffed, her fingers drumming a sharp rhythm on the table. "Alive? That's a bit dramatic even for you." "Not if the stories are true," Silas countered, his tone sharpening. "A crystal bell that only rings once a year, and only at the exact stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve. It's no accident it's kept in a monastery on a mountain no one dares to climb." The table fell silent as the weight of his words settled. Ren shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his calloused hands gripping his glass. Why would anyone keep something like that hidden, if it's as powerful as you say? Dahlia, who had been staring into the flickering firelight, finally spoke. Her voice was as soft as falling snow, but it carried an edge that cut through the room. Because power like that is never free. The bell answers only to the pure of heart, and for the rest of us. She trailed off, her gaze meeting Silas's. "It answers differently," Silas finished, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But that's where we come in. We don't need to ring it for salvation. We just need to take it. And when we do..." He let the promise hang in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Juno leaned back, her skepticism replaced by curiosity. "What exactly does it do?" "Depends on who you ask," Silas replied. "Some say it grants immortality. Others claim it can rewrite destiny itself. But the monks who guard it believe its toll can bring ruin or redemption." The flicker of unease crossed Ren's face again. "And you think we can get it out without ringing it?" "Not a problem," Juno interjected, confidence blazing in her sharp green eyes. "I've already mapped the monastery's layout. Security's tight, sure, but the real barriers are magical. That's why we've got Dahlia." Dahlia tilted her head, her dark curls casting shadows across her pale features. "I'll need to be close to neutralize the wards, closer than I'd like." "You'll manage," Silas assured her. "And Ren?" Ren's frown deepened. "I'll get the vault open. Just don't expect me to stick around for the fireworks." Silas grinned, his teeth flashing like a wolf's. "Fair enough. Midnight's the key. If we time it right, we'll be in and out before anyone even knows we were there." The faint strains of a violin drifted through the tavern, mingling with the low hum of conversation. Outside, snow began to fall, muffling the world in an eerie silence. "You've been chasing legends for years, Silas," Juno said after a long pause. "What makes this one worth the risk?" Silas's expression darkened, his gaze fixed on the flame dancing in the hearth. Because this one isn't just a story, it's real. And it's going to change everything. As the firelight cast flickering shadows across their faces, a strange sensation settled over the group. A mixture of anticipation and foreboding, as though the very air around them had grown heavier. None of them noticed the hooded figure at the far end of the tavern, watching them from the gloom. Nor did they see the faint shimmer of light around his eyes, like the reflection of stars caught in a darkened pool. When the group dispersed into the snow-draped night, their footsteps fading into the cold, the figure stood and turned toward the door. His voice was no louder than a whisper, but it carried as if spoken into the wind. "The bell tolls for more than just the hour," he murmured. "May you have the courage to pay its price." The monastery loomed like a ghost atop the jagged mountain, its spires veiled in perpetual frost. Beneath a canopy of stars, Silas and his crew gathered in the shadows of a cliffside, their breath misting in the frigid air. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it an otherworldly chill that seemed to cut deeper than the cold. Juno knelt in the snow, spreading out a map illuminated by a lantern's dim light. Her fingers danced over the lines and symbols she had carefully sketched during weeks of research. The first obstacle is the gate. The monks inscribed runes along its frame, a sequence meant to confuse anyone without the knowledge to decode them. "Dahlia, that's where you come in." Dahlia crouched beside her, her cloak pooling like ink in the snow. She traced the runes with a gloved finger, murmuring words too soft for the others to hear. The runes on the map seemed to shimmer faintly in response. "It's a ward of misdirection," she said finally, her voice as steady as the mountain itself. "One wrong move, and we'll find ourselves wandering in circles until dawn. I can neutralize it, but only for a few moments." Ren adjusted the leather strap of his toolkit, his expression grim. "Once we're inside, the real challenge begins. The vault's lock isn't just mechanical, it's enchanted. I'll need absolute silence to break it." Silas nodded, his eyes fixed on the monastery. "That's why we moved together. No distractions, no mistakes. Midnight is the only window we have." He turned to Dahlia, his gaze sharpening. "What about the bell's chamber? What can we expect?" Dahlia hesitated, her hand brushing the pendant she wore around her neck. "The chamber is alive with magic. The closer we get to the bell, the stronger its influence will be. It'll try to distract us, to tempt us with visions." "Visions of what?" Juno asked, her tone skeptical. "Whatever it thinks will break you," Dahlia said simply. Her words hung in the air like frost on glass. Silas's jaw tightened. "We don't stop for anything. The bell rings at midnight and we're gone before the final chime." The crew exchanged glances, the weight of the plan pressing down on them. Despite their bravado, there was an unspoken understanding that this heist was unlike any other. They weren't just stealing an artifact, They were trespassing into something far older, far stranger. The ascent to the monastery was treacherous, the icy paths barely visible under the pale moonlight. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the only sound in an otherwise unnerving silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as they approached the gates. The runes etched into the stone glowed faintly, their light flickering like the embers of a dying fire. Dahlia stepped forward, her breath curling in the air as she began to chant in a low, melodic tone. The runes responded, their light brightening, then dimming, as if reluctant to yield. "Hurry!" Silas hissed, his eyes darting to the darkened windows of the monastery. With a final word, Dahlia placed her palm against the gate. The runes faded into darkness, and the massive doors creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched into the shadows. They moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing softly against the cold stone walls. The monastery's interior was a labyrinth of vaulted ceilings and arched doorways, every corner cloaked in an oppressive stillness. Candles flickered in iron sconces, their flames casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach for the intruders. Ren led the way to the vault, his tools clinking softly as he worked. The enchanted lock resisted his touch, its intricate mechanisms seemingly alive under his careful manipulation. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. "Almost there," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Time stretched, each second an eternity. The faint chime of a clock somewhere deep within the monastery struck 11:45 p.m. Silas clenched his fists, his eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of movement. Finally, with a soft click, the lock surrendered. Ren exhaled shakily and pushed the door open, revealing a staircase spiraling upward into darkness. The ascent to the bell's chamber was suffused with an unnatural tension. The air grew heavier with each step, as if the monastery itself resisted their presence. Whispers began to echo faintly around them, not words, but an unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Keep moving," Silas ordered, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. At the top of the staircase, a massive iron door barred their way. Unlike the others, this one bore no lock or mechanism, only a single rune carved into its surface. Dahlia stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She traced the rune with trembling fingers, her lips moving silently. The door groaned and swung open, revealing the bell's chamber. It was breathtaking. The crystal bell hung suspended in the center of the room, its surface shimmering like frozen starlight. The light it cast was ethereal, illuminating the chamber in a way that seemed to banish shadows entirely. Silas took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. "We've made it," he whispered. But as the clock struck 11:58 p.m., the bell began to hum. a soft, resonant sound that vibrated through the room. And then, the shadows began to move. The sound was barely perceptible at first, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the crystal bell itself. It rippled through the chamber like a shiver of wind through still water, growing louder with each passing second. The crew stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the artifact that glowed with an eerie, pulsing light. "What is it doing?" Ren whispered, his voice trembling despite his efforts to mask it. Dahlia stepped forward, her gaze locked on the bell. "It's awakening," she murmured, almost reverently. "The magic tied to it is older than anything we understand. It senses us." Juno, always the skeptic, scoffed, though her voice was strained. "It's a bell, not a sentient being. It doesn't sense anything." As if in defiance, the hum deepened, and the light from the bell flickered, casting long twisting shadows against the chamber walls. The air grew heavy, dense with an invisible force that seemed to press against their lungs. "Stay focused!" Silas barked, his tone sharper than usual. "Dahlia, neutralize the last ward. Juno, prepare the extraction route. Ren, get ready to move the bell." But as the crew moved into position, the shadows began to shift. What had once been indistinct patches of darkness now coalesced into forms. Vague humanoid shapes that moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. They hovered at the edges of the room, their presence more felt than seen, as though they existed just out of reach of true perception. Ren froze, his tools clattering to the floor. What are those?" he stammered, backing away. Dahlia's voice was low, steady, though her hands trembled as she retrieved a vial of shimmering liquid from her satchel. "They're guardians," she said. "The bell's magic isn't unprotected. These shadows are drawn from the bell itself, echoes of those who have tried to claim it before." "Echoes?" Juno snapped, panic creeping into her voice. "They don't look like echoes to me." The shadows surged forward slightly, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Though they had no faces, their attention seemed focused on the group. The air was thick with a palpable menace, a silent warning that no words could convey. "Dahlia, whatever you're doing, do it faster," Silas growled, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his belt. Dahlia knelt before the bell, her voice rising in a chant that seemed to pull light from the chamber and funnel it toward the artifact. The shadows hesitated, as if the sound of her incantation repelled them. But the momentary pause didn't last. They began to encroach once more, their movements growing bolder with each passing second. Juno frantically tapped on her tablet, the glowing screen reflecting the sweat on her brow. "The wards around this place are reactivating," she muttered, her voice laced with urgency. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before we're completely sealed in." "That's more time than we need," Silas replied, though his confidence faltered as one of the shadow figures stepped closer. The creature's form was indistinct, a ripple of darkness against the bell's ethereal light, but its presence carried an overwhelming weight. The creature extended what might have been an arm, and for a moment Silas felt his mind flicker. Memories, emotions, fragments of his past flashing before his eyes. He staggered back, his breathing ragged. "Don't look at them!" Dahlia shouted, her voice breaking through the haze. "They feed on your mind, your fears. Keep your focus." Ren, shaking but resolute, moved to the bell. His hands reached for the crystalline surface, but as his fingers grazed it, the bell emitted a single resonant chime. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the chamber, vibrating through their bones. The shadows recoiled momentarily, but their retreat was short-lived. They began to shift again, their forms becoming sharper, more distinct. Faces began to emerge, faces they recognized. Ren's hand dropped to his side as he stared in horror at the figure before him. A boy, no older than 10, with wide, accusing eyes. "No," Ren whispered, his voice trembling. "Not you." Juno stepped back, her hands raised defensively as a woman materialized before her, her expression one of bitter disappointment. "You left me," the figure said, its voice a low, haunting echo. "You left us all." Dahlia faltered in her chant as a shadow approached her, its form that of a man cloaked in darkness. His voice was soft, almost tender. "You swore you'd never come back." Silas clenched his fists, his teeth grinding as the shadows encircled him. Their faces shifted, morphing into people he had betrayed, people he had failed. One figure, more solid than the rest, stepped forward. It was him, an older, wearier version, his eyes hollow and his face marked by regret. "What are you doing, Silas?" the shadow of himself asked. "Do you even know?" The bell's hum grew louder, resonating in a way that seemed to drown out everything else. The shadows closed in, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusation and despair. The crew was paralyzed, each of them trapped in the grip of their own fears. And then, as the clock struck 11:59, the bell flared with blinding light. The shadows froze, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke. The room fell silent, save for the lingering resonance of the bell's toll. Silas staggered forward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We're running out of time," he said hoarsely. "We either take it now, or we leave empty-handed." Dahlia looked up at him, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not the shadows that should worry us. It's what happens when the bell rings at midnight." Silas met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in as the final seconds ticked away. The chamber was utterly still, save for the faint vibration that lingered in the air from the bell's hum. Midnight approached, its presence pressing down like a weight they couldn't see but could all feel. The air shimmered faintly, and the crystal bell glowed brighter with every passing second, casting fractured light across the room. Silas clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the bell as if it held all the answers he had ever sought. "This is it," he muttered. "No turning back now." Dahlia, still kneeling at the base of the bell, shook her head slowly. Her voice was hoarse but firm. "You don't understand. The bell isn't just a relic. It's alive in ways we can't comprehend. It's not meant to be taken, Silas." Juno, standing near the edge of the chamber, was pale but resolute. "Then why protect it with wards and traps? Why let it exist if no one's supposed to use it?" "Because it chooses," Dahlia replied. Her voice was low, almost drowned out by the increasing hum of the bell. "It chooses what it gives, and what it takes." A deep, resonant chime broke through her words, soft at first, but quickly filling the room with a sound that was both melodic and menacing. Midnight was moments away. The light from the bell shifted, no longer steady but pulsing, like the heartbeat of something ancient and vast. Wren, who had been standing closest to the bell, stumbled back, his face pale. "I felt it," he said, his voice trembling. "When I touched it earlier, I saw things. Memories I didn't want to remember. Regrets I thought I buried. It was inside me." "Enough!" Silas barked, his voice cutting through the growing tension. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "We came here for a reason. The bell is ours now. Whatever magic it holds, we'll make it work for us." He reached for the bell, but Dahlia sprang to her feet, grabbing his wrist. "You don't understand. The bell wants you to take it. That's how it traps you." Silas yanked his arm free, his face a mask of anger and desperation. "Then let it trap me. Let it do whatever it wants, so long as it gets us out of here with more than we had before." The chamber fell silent as the final second ticked away, and then the clock struck midnight. The first chime of the crystal bell was unlike any sound they had ever heard. It wasn't just a note. It was a vibration that resonated through the air, the walls, their bones. It carried with it an overwhelming sense of presence. The light from the bell exploded outward, engulfing the room in a brilliance that banished every shadow. But the brightness wasn't comforting. It was cold, clinical, exposing everything as it truly was. The crew staggered, each of them gripped by something they couldn't see, but could feel deep within their souls. The light refracted around them, transforming the chamber into a kaleidoscope of visions. For Wren, the boy appeared again, his wide, accusing eyes filled with silent judgment. "You could have saved me," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible but cutting deeper than any scream. Juno was surrounded by faces, former allies, people she had betrayed to secure her place in the world. Their mouths moved silently, but their expressions screamed of pain and betrayal. Dahlia saw the man again, the one from the shadows, his face a mixture of sorrow and anger. "You swore you wouldn't return," he said, his words echoing in her mind. "You knew what this place would demand." And Silas stood face to face with himself. The older version of him was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his face etched with lines of despair. "This is your future," the shadow self said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You take and you take, but there's nothing left for you in the end. Only regret." The second chime rang out, louder this time, shaking the very foundation of the monastery. The visions faded, replaced by an all-consuming darkness. "What's happening?" Juno cried out, her voice barely audible over the deafening hum that filled the air. "The bell is deciding," Dahlia whispered, her face pale as death. "It's deciding what to give and what to take." Silas staggered toward the bell, his movements sluggish, as if the air itself fought against him. "No more riddles," he shouted. "I take what I want. That's how it works." As he reached for the bell, his fingers brushed its surface, and the final chime rang out. A sound so loud and pure it seemed to tear reality itself. The room exploded with light and sound, a crescendo of magic that flung the crew backward. When the light faded, the chamber was silent once more. Silas lay on the ground, staring at the ceiling with wide, unseeing eyes. The bell hung where it had before, untouched, its glow dim and steady. "Silas!" Dahlia called, crawling toward him. He blinked, then sat up slowly, his expression vacant. "It's gone," he murmured. "Everything's gone." "What's gone?" Juno demanded, though she already felt the answer creeping into her bones. "Wait," Silas whispered. His voice was hollow, empty. "There's nothing left. No ambition, no fire. The bell took it all." The crew exchanged horrified glances as the bell hummed faintly, a final note of quiet satisfaction. Outside, fireworks lit the night sky, their colours stark against the darkness. Midnight had come and gone, and the bell's toll was complete. The silence that followed the bell's final toll was deafening, a vacuum that swallowed every sound and thought. The crew lay scattered across the chamber, their breathing shallow, their minds reeling from what they had just endured. The crystal bell hung above them, its glow dim now, like a flame burned to its last ember. It was Wren who first broke the stillness, his voice trembling as he sat up and stared at Silas. "What do you mean it's gone? What did it take from you?" Silas didn't answer. His eyes, once filled with fire and ambition, were dull, unfocused, as though a vital piece of him had been hollowed out. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped, the words caught in his throat. Finally, he whispered, "Everything." Wren looked to Juno and Dahlia, his panic growing. "What does that mean? What the hell does that mean?" Juno, always the skeptic, was already on her feet, pacing in tight, frantic circles. This isn't how it was supposed to go. We were supposed to take the bell, not let it, whatever it just did, take from us." She glared at Dahlia, her voice rising. "You knew, didn't you? You knew it would turn on us." Dahlia, still kneeling, looked up at Juno with haunted eyes. "I warned you," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "The bell doesn't give without taking. I told you not to touch it before the final chime, but none of you listened." Juno threw her hands in the air, her frustration spilling over. "And what about you, Dahlia? What did it take from you?" Dahlia hesitated, her gaze drifting to the bell. For a moment she seemed lost, as though she was sifting through memories that weren't entirely her own. "It took the choice I didn't make," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "The life I could have had if I had never come here." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the group like the cold stone walls of the monastery. The crystal bell began to hum again, faintly, its light flickering like a heartbeat. Ren's head snapped toward it, his face pale. "What now? It's done, isn't it? Midnight's over." "It's not done," Dahlia murmured, her voice carrying a strange, fatalistic calm. "It never really is. The bell doesn't just stop, it lingers." She stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she carried an invisible weight. "We need to leave. Now." Juno's fingers twitched, her eyes darting back to the bell. "We can't just leave it here. After everything, it's still the prize we came for." "No," Dahlia said sharply, her voice cutting through Juno's protests. "The bell is not a prize, it's a curse. And if we stay any longer, it'll find more to take." Silas finally rose to his feet, swaying slightly as though the ground beneath him wasn't entirely solid. His expression was distant, his voice a shadow of its former self. "She's right," he said, his tone devoid of its usual edge. "We leave it." Juno's face twisted in frustration, but she didn't argue. The bell hummed again, louder this time, as if it sensed their hesitation. They retraced their steps through the monastery, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated, as though the place itself was draining the last of their strength. The once quiet corridors now seemed alive with faint whispers, voices too distant to make out but impossible to ignore. As they reached the outer gates, the cold night air hit them like a slap, a harsh reminder of the world they had nearly left behind. The snow had stopped falling, and the valley below was lit by the final bursts of New Year's fireworks. For a moment, they stood there in silence, staring out at the world that seemed so far removed from the chamber they had left behind. "What happens now?" Ren asked, his voice raw. Silas didn't answer. He simply began walking down the mountain path, his footsteps crunching in the snow. The others followed, their silence heavy with unspoken fears and regrets. The monastery faded into the distance, its dark silhouette blending with the jagged peaks. The bell's toll still echoed faintly in their minds, a haunting reminder of the price they had paid. Days later, rumors began to spread. Travelers spoke of a strange, solitary figure haunting the ruins of the monastery, warning anyone who dared to approach. "Beware the bell," the figure was said to whisper. "It doesn't just take what you have, it takes what you are." None of the crew ever returned to the monastery. Silas disappeared entirely, his name fading into the shadows of forgotten legends. Juno and Wren went their separate ways, their lives haunted by the choices they had made that night. And Dahlia, she became the last keeper of the story, her voice weaving the tale of the crystal bell into a warning for those who sought power without understanding its cost. In the end, the bell remained where it had always been, waiting, watching, and tolling for the souls brave or foolish enough to seek it. For the bell's power was eternal, and its price absolute.